So I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm delighted to welcome you to this event with Ambassador Melanne Verveer on investing in women, the global policy imperative. This is the culminating event for this term in a series that we have done. There will be another event in the winter, at least one more. The series is entitled Women in Policy, Rising Voices for Equality, Empowerment, Security, and Peace. And the previous events, I know many of you were there, included former President Atifete Georgetown of Kosovo and former Undersecretary of Defense Michelle Flournoy. I have to say this is in some ways the event I've been looking forward to most, and I've been looking forward to it for several years, I should add, because it's not just about the experience of women in power, but rather it's about what can be achieved in the world by empowering women. And just to give you a little of the backstory, when I got to Dartmouth in January of 2013, and I wasn't thinking about the fact that it was 18 below zero, one of the things that I resolved to do was to create two new pillars in the Dickey Center, two new areas of activity. One was on economic development, and the other was on gender. And I should add that I decided to do that because having worked alongside Melanne Verveer at the State Department and under Hillary Clinton, I came to recognize that issues of development and poverty alleviation, conflict resolution, democratization, and the like, all to a significant extent hinge on the role of women in society. As economists and policymakers, from Nobel laureate Amartya Sen to IMF Chairman Christine Lagarde, have underscored, investment in the education of women and girls provides extraordinary benefits in terms of poverty alleviation, greater agency, population growth, and social change. And that's why the World Bank, national development agencies, and international NGOs of all kinds have made women's empowerment a top priority in their engagement around the world. Melanne Verveer is one of the heroes of this story. She served as the first U.S. ambassador for global women's issues, a position that she was nominated to by President Obama in 2009. And in that position, she coordinated foreign policy issues and activities relating to the political, economic, and social advancement of women. And she did so at a remarkable pace, traveling to nearly 60 countries and being involved in just about every aspect of foreign policy you can imagine. She worked to ensure women's participation and rights were fully integrated into U.S. foreign policy. She played a leadership role in the administration's development of the U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. And she was really the go-to person on these issues in every single context. Not surprisingly, President Obama also appointed her to serve as the U.S. representative to the UN Commission on the Status of Women. Before coming into the administration, from 2000 to 2008, she was chair and co-CEO of the Vital Voices Global Partnership, an international NGO that she co-founded to invest in emerging women leaders. She's well known to many because before that, she served as assistant to the president and chief of staff to the First Lady in the Clinton administration. And among her many duties was overseeing Hillary Clinton's global initiatives on women's rights as human rights. So if you remember the Beijing conference, from now on you should always have an image of Melanne in your head as well. She also led the effort to establish the President's Interagency Council on Women and was instrumental in the adoption of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. She is the co-author of Fast Forward, How Women Can Achieve Power and Purpose, which was published last year. She is now the executive director, and I accept that I am merely director of the Dickey Center. She is executive director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, which examines and highlights the roles and experiences of women in peace and security worldwide through advanced research, global convenings, and strategic partnerships. And I think that her institute is really a model for what we will see growing up in universities around the country and around the world. I can't say how grateful I am to Melanne for coming. It's been a challenge getting her here because she's always had extraordinarily important things to do. She was supposed to come last spring. We've been talking about this for 3 or 4 years. She was one of the first people I decided to invite to the Dickey Center. She was going to come last spring and then suddenly had to head off to Vienna because she is special representative on the status of women to that organization. So she's hard to pin down, and I'm thrilled and consider it a great act of friendship that she came to Dartmouth. So please welcome Melanne Verveer.
Dan, I'm going to give you a... Well, it's so nice to be here with my friend Dan Benjamin. And I think if I only were empowered, I would immediately designate him executive director of the Dickey Center because he certainly does an extraordinary job here. It's a particular pleasure for me to be here at Dartmouth, which is producing among the best and the brightest throughout its long history. And I've had some introduction to the next generation of the best and the brightest as I've met with so many of the students today. I want to give a shout out to Verveer, who's sitting here in the front row, because he was most recently, I think this is true, Rand, basically the acting secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, which is no easy task, but I have followed his career over many, many years now, and he's made just enormous contributions to the United States government, particularly in the security space. And it's wonderful that this Dartmouth alum is now paying it forward here at Dartmouth as I am paying it forward at Georgetown. So we're all doing this after so many years in government, I guess. I want to properly say something about Dan Benjamin, who as you heard him say, we were colleagues in government, both in the White House and during his time at the State Department. We're sort of itinerants in a way, making our way into academia at this stage in our lives. He was in the State Department most recently when I was there as ambassador, coordinating countering terrorism, which is certainly one of the most urgent security challenges that confronts us in these times. And I must say that you here at Dartmouth, those of you who are a part of this community, have in him one of the most recognized experts in international security. So to the executive director of the Dickey Center, I say all of this and more. I also want to say that I've had quite an extraordinary day so far. I started early this morning with the postdocs, and we had just a fascinating conversation about their work post getting their PhDs at some of the most preeminent academic institutions in our country, now here at Yale doing, now here at Dartmouth doing, I was thinking of the one from Yale, doing extraordinary postdoc work. But the discussion ranged from everything to the status of NGOs who are besieged in so many countries today to what's happening in Ukraine and Syria and their perspectives from their long work in the field. And then I met with some undergraduates who are involved in human development, and some of the questions that enter into all of those discussions about where does our sort of strategic geopolitical questions fit in with development, what are the complexities in development, what should be done to measure progress in development. So that was a fascinating discussion. Then I did a class on gender and politics, and there couldn't be a more relevant topic today given what's happening in our presidential election. You know, had just lots and lots of questions and good conversation. And most immediately, I met with the Great Issues undergraduates. And again, a very stimulating conversation. So You know, I'm just convinced that there's enough talent to comprise the next generation of leaders in international affairs here at Dartmouth right now, and I want to live so long to see how they all save us from some of the worst difficulties that our world confronts, because I feel in some ways my generation has messed things up quite significantly, so we need to do better. As Dan said, I have co-authored this book called Fast Forward, which is now in paperback, to recognize and sort of put in one place what I've learned over these many years, convinced that each of us has considerable power, whether we're on the faculty or whether we're community leaders or whether we're students, that no matter where we find ourselves, we have the opportunity to use our power for purpose, to really make a difference. And if we find our purpose and connect with others, there's no telling what we can do to create a better world. Now, my purpose in writing the book was to really try to energize readers to get involved into advancing progress for women and girls around the world, because I believe we are at an historic moment when we have the confluence of many changes for the better, and that we basically cannot afford to wait another 100 years to make some of these advances for half the population of the world. Nick Kristof has reminded us that the greatest moral challenge of the 21st century is women's equality. And although women have advanced significantly in so many ways over the years, they still comprise the vast majority of the world's poor and unschooled. There are roughly every 90 seconds, a woman dies in childbirth. Women are still a relatively small minority in parliaments and boardrooms, and certainly missing from negotiating tables where peace agreements are being crafted. All of these decisions affecting them in one way or another, but where they still have no voice. And violence against women and girls is a global scourge, whether it's child marriage or human trafficking or domestic violence or killing girl babies merely because they're born girls, whether it has to do with rape as a strategic tool of war, which we see in so many of the conflicts around the globe, and so many other horrors from South Sudan to Syria to what ISIS is perpetrating, and more. Women and girls are being purposefully targeted as a strategic tool. Even those who are trying to go to school, what Boko Haram has done in Nigeria, for example, or Malala taking a bullet just because she was trying to stand up for the rights of girls to go to school. And violence as we know it is not confined to the rest of the world. We deal with it in our own country, in our campuses, and in fact it has certainly rather seriously intruded its ways into our presidential campaign. But the story of women, and I want to stress this, around the world is not solely what they have endured. And I think this would be a very narrow way to look at the situation, because to me, it's even more how women are transcending their situations and changing the world for the better. You know, I was in Kabul in Afghanistan one night, and I have never forgotten this, this discussion. I was with a small group of women, and the first one said to me as this discussion began, "Stop looking at us as victims and look at us as the leaders that we are." And I have thought about that over and over since she said it to me. And I realized the rightness of what she said, because we would gather, you know, whether it was Dan and me and our colleagues in the State Department sitting around a big table trying to determine what strategic policies we should pursue. And if we only looked at women in these places as victims, we were missing the real story. They were on the front lines of change. They were change makers. They were people with agency and voice who were needed to move their societies forward. Because it is a fact that no country can get ahead if it leaves half of its people behind. And we have so many challenges, from climate change to peace and security issues to economic growth and the need to create jobs, to addressing the quality of governance, that we cannot begin to do unless we tap the talents of all of our people. And, you know, I don't think that we can any longer afford to relegate these issues to that place on the side, women's issues. Because yes, they're about issues, but they're also affecting all of society. When women make progress, everybody makes progress. And yet too often these have been the nice concerns, we'll get to them when we can, but rarely factored in as something that needs to be dealt with in terms of what it truly represents. And I think Secretary Clinton got this exactly right, very succinctly, when she talked about the stakes. And she said, until women around the world are accorded their rights and afforded opportunities to fully participate in the lives of their societies, global progress and global prosperity will have its own glass ceiling. Because we are not only shortchanging women, we are shortchanging our world and the potential that should be tapped and released in addressing some of these crucial challenges. This administration has made empowering women and girls a cornerstone of our foreign policy, because it is in the vital interest of the United States to do so. This is fundamentally a moral issue. It is a humanitarian issue. It is a human rights issue, if you will. It is the right thing to do. But it is also the smart and strategic thing to do. And what I found is that when we can demonstrate the second part of that equation, fundamentally guided as we are by the moral imperative, the skeptics can respond much more in a way where they understand it is in their own vital interests in what they are trying to pursue in the terms of government decision-making, for example, that enables them to move forward in this space. So what I want to talk about this afternoon is why investing in women is a global policy imperative. And it is based on something we've known and worked together on in government over several years, and particularly in my most recent experience as ambassador on these issues. When I was named and confirmed, the secretary said to me, this is not about a nice set of activities that focus on women's issues. It's not special projects. It's not some special initiatives. Those are fine. And we can do as much as we can. But it is really about integrating these issues throughout the whole of the State Department's work. Whether that work has to do with conflict and stabilization, whether it has to do with counterterrorism, whether it has to do with economics, whether it has to do with all the regional considerations in which we're engaged, whether it has to do with human rights, that we try to integrate these issues because that will enable us to be that much more effective in what we're trying to achieve. So first, U.S. foreign policy and global economic growth. One of the big challenges we face the world over is how to grow economies, how to create jobs, how to advance inclusive prosperity for all people. The World Bank has said that gender equality is smart economics. And what we know today is there is a growing plethora of research and data on the way in which women's economic participation has tremendous positive outcomes for the kinds of economic expansion we all seek and we all want to see in our world. That vital source of growth needs to be tapped. And I'll just mention a few of these studies to sort of give you a sense of what we're talking about. The World Economic Forum, for example, involves a lot of the major economic and business leaders of the world, and they do an awful lot of research. They've never been accused of being a women's organization, but they put out an annual gender gap report. Now, why do they put out a gender gap report? And in this report, they look at the gap between men and women in all the given countries in which there is the data, some 100 and some countries, because what they have found in applying 4 metrics, access to health, education, economic participation, and political empowerment, is in those countries where that gap is closer to being closed, and nowhere is it closed, but where it is closer to being closed, those countries are far more economically competitive and prosperous. And it's in the interest of the World Economic Forum to drive economic competitiveness and prosperity. We also know from the data that women invest their money differently, their incomes differently, and that up to 90% is invested into their families and into their communities, into food, health, education, the kinds of things that get plowed back into the community and raise up the standard of living, which matters greatly, particularly in societies where this is a critical need. Studies also show that women entrepreneurs, those who drive small and medium-sized businesses, are particularly catalytic in driving economic growth. The World Bank calls these SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, the missing middle, critical to growing economies. We've got the big companies. We've got what happens at the micro level. Microcredit is something I think everybody's familiar with. It has enabled the poorest of the poor to transform their lives, but it's on a very low level of bringing income into a family and then perhaps enabling them through some very small enterprises, milk from cows, for example, that they're able to sell and then raise the nutrition of their families at the same time, has that micro kind of impact. But SMEs give you a big wallop. But one of the critical factors is that women face extraordinary barriers in terms of being able to start and grow their businesses. There are laws, customs, sometimes values that fuel roadblocks that enable them from moving forward. In some places, there are no rights to inheritance or to owning property. Increasingly, in places that are more developed, it's the lack of training or mentors, certainly access to markets, and one of the critical needs is access to finance. So there's been a real focus on trying to address some of these needs, and in fact, McKinsey Institute recently did one of the most comprehensive studies on why women, if enabled through closing of the gender gap, could add $12 to $28 trillion to the world economy. But for that to happen, these inhibitors need to be addressed. And they lay out a large number, from violence against women to lack of education, to the fact that there are so many constraints within societies based on discrimination that keep that from happening. And one of the ways, just to give you an example, that we dealt with this in the State Department is we engaged in a lot of multilateral platforms with other countries coming together. I'll just give you one example, which was APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, which is the 21 economies of the Asia-Pacific region. And one of our colleagues came in to me one day and said, well, are you guys going to be participating in APEC? And I said, look, I've looked at all the materials there's nothing about women in the economy. And I don't get it, because the data shows that by one statistic from the UN, that $90 billion is being lost annually in GDP in the region alone because the potential of women isn't being tapped. And he said, I said to him, can we do anything about this? And to make a long story short, very short, we were able to work with the leaders of APEC that year, followed in the United States, where the first ever Women in the Economy Summit was held as part of APEC. A declaration was passed that all of the leaders, private sector leaders and heads of state, adhered to and passed. And today, it is one of the very vibrant components of APEC. I just came back from Taiwan a couple of days ago, where they're really focused on the role of technology in these 21 economies based on women's access and participation in this space. And we did this with respect to the African Women's Entrepreneurship Program that was based on some trade agreements we had, on partnerships with the Americans, and so on. So this is this integrative model, recognizing the evidence-based case and acting on it. So all of this and so much more underscores the primary point I want to make, which is when we liberate the economic potential of women, we not only elevate their prospects, but also the economic performance of communities, of nations, and certainly our world. Investing in women and girls is one of the most powerful tools we have also for alleviating poverty and improving the human condition. So what I want to do is also focus on the second aspect, which is our foreign policy, gender, and development, recognizing that in development it is critical, if we're going to alleviate poverty and address the most entrenched practices that are keeping people down, releasing again the capacity for women and girls by investing in them makes a whole lot of sense. A macro example of that is sending a girl to school. And it wasn't that many years ago, frankly, when we were working together in the White House, Dan, when this was an issue that was hardly on the development agenda. Today, you wouldn't recognize it because there is so much more awareness of just how critical it is, because these investments in the girl represent ultimate investments in her family, in her community. She, when she has children, will space those children. She will provide higher levels of nutrition to them, and her own income will be higher than it would have been without that education. So it is one of those critical areas for investment, and yet it is one against which there are many difficulties today. The violent extremists focus on education a great deal. But there are many parents in the developing world who, not because they're evil people, but they don't see the value of investing in a girl. And in some societies, that value is de minimis at best. And so you look at an issue like child marriage, which is a real problem. Some 15 million girls are married when they are still children. That's 39,000 girls every day. They basically have their childhoods stolen from them. And one of the data points coming out of the refugee camps today, particularly with the Syrian refugees, is the number of girls that are being pushed into child marriage because their parents, particularly their fathers, see that as a solution to their precarious situation, and that somehow they'll be better off. And the stories that one reads about the girls who are pulled out of their school setting, as anemic as it might be in some ways, are just tragic to read because they feel that their own futures are being snuffed out of them. So one of the things that we have been working on in government, in development, is how to incentivize getting girls into school and keeping them in school. And the incentives can be anything like a bag of flour to the family or some tuition support, to a variety of programs. And one that I find particularly intriguing is what the Nike Foundation was doing to ensure that girls' standing would be enhanced. And what they were doing was deeding an animal, a goat, for example, to the child, who would then benefit the family because she now has this benefit, this goat, which will bring income to the family and nutrition to the family, and that enables them to part with her to go to school. And I heard not too long ago about a father who said to his daughter, "It's time for you to be married off." And she explained to him that she wanted to stay in school and did not want to get married. And his response was that she couldn't pursue that option because it wasn't an option he was going to allow. And she finally, thinking, what can I do, because I do not want to leave school and I don't want to be relegated to my future being like so many others' future, and I aspire to something else, she said, well, then I'm taking the cow with me or the goat with me, whatever the case was. And he said, no, that goat belongs to the family. And she said, no, that goat belongs to me. That's how the transaction was made. Long story short, in this case, the goat enabled her to stay in school because he was not willing to part with the goat. And so whatever it takes, but incentives in some of these situations play a very critical role. One other area I'll mention is agriculture. Women are significant actors in agriculture, but one of the problems, as significant as their numbers are and their participation is that they don't have equal access to resources, which significantly limits their potential of enhancing their productivity. And so they're at a severe disadvantage when it comes to the kinds of things they need, whether access to credit or training or fertilizer or any number of things. And the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization did its annual report on women as vital actors in agriculture. And at the same time, the administration has a major development initiative called Feed the Future, the goal of which is to really enhance productivity so that more food is available given the kinds of shortages that exist. But because of this gender gap, the kind of productivity that would enable women to engage in ways that provide more output, they are kept back. And what this study showed, that if the gap were closed, individual yields would increase by 20 to 30%, and this is the thing that's stunning, and that the boost to productivity overall would reduce the number of undernourished people in the world by 150 million globally. Again, if we made the right kind of investments on the level and scale that could tap this potential, we would be better off in terms of the global community. And that's one of the reasons this Feed the Future initiative has been trying to integrate gender into all aspects and measuring the results to ensure that that's exactly how it's being played out. So this whole area of global development, and it was interesting for me to meet with the students who are interested in this space, has so many different components to it where gender is a very critical element. And I don't have time to go into much of any of that, but suffice it to say, it ranges from climate change and the difference that can be made in climate to technology, where something as simple as the simple cell phone, mobile technology, can be one of the most impactful tools for transforming women's lives, because it enables them to get vital information that they ordinarily couldn't get. It enables them to protect themselves from violence in circumstances, but most critically, it provides the possibility for the first time for the poor to be able to transfer their money, their incomes, small as they might be, safely, financial transfer of their resources, and to save safely, something that is impossible for them to do, and to do that through the cell phone. And so mobile banking and financial inclusion are one of the big dramatic spaces in development today that have this huge gender component. And in mobile, unfortunately, there is again a huge gender gap given how important it is to women's development. It is something, when we were working together at state, and that continues, working closely with mobile telephone operators to enable them to see investments in the poor as something ultimately that can be both a sound business investment and can be a transformative tool for development. And then the last aspect I want to talk about U.S. foreign policy and gender is the role of women in peace and security. And that advancing women is not just important for the economy and development, but is also about global security. Today, women are largely shut out of negotiations that seek to end conflict, as well as the decision-making process that shapes post-conflict reconstruction. More than half of the peace agreements end in the first 5 years in which they're enacted. I think by any stretch, we need to do better in this space because so much rides on it, and this is certainly one critical element of it. The UN Security Council, just about 15 years ago, linked women to peace and security, and they considered it important, and there are a variety of issues that they laid out in the process of developing this extraordinary framework. Unfortunately, the enforcement, the implementation hasn't been what it needs to be. To accelerate that for the United States, as Dan mentioned, the United States, the administration launched a national action plan on women, peace, and security. As the president said, it's a roadmap to accelerate our own efforts in development, in the way we do diplomacy, in the way that we operate within the Defense Department to really better incorporate the agency of women in this space. And this goes from Afghanistan to all of the other areas in which we are involved today. Lema Gabawi was instrumental in moving the peace forward in Liberia. And I don't know any of you who've seen the documentary Pray the Devil Back to Hell, which laid out exactly the critical role they played. The civil war there had gone on for more than a decade, and the women understood nothing would change unless they organized. And Lema, with the women behind her, bravely stood up to that ruthless power of Charles Taylor, who was at the center of the conflict, and demanded that he negotiate an end to the violence. And this led to that negotiations taking place, the women basically surrounding the area in which they were meeting, just an incredible outpouring of simple people, market women, deciding that they just had to do something if anything was going to change. She was a peace builder, obviously, with Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who became the first African female president, and they were recognized with the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011 for their efforts. And I love what Lema said about this struggle. She said, even at your worst, you have power in you to do something. And that's what we intended to do. And when Ellen Johnson Sirleaf became president, one of the key things that she said was, invest in the market women, because they deserve it, they need it to go forward, and they have done extraordinary things. So there are 4 areas in the Security Council resolution. Prevention, recognizing that the condition of women is something we should look at. They're like canaries in the mines, where oppression of women and denial of their rights is taking place. It often leads to greater instability and future conflict. And we, I think, across the board, do a lousy job in prevention. Participation in peace negotiations, as the women in Liberia did, as in Northern Ireland, as in most recently in the Philippines, with an extraordinary agreement with the Mindanao rebels that was led by a female negotiator for the first time. The agreement that was voted down in Colombia is another extraordinary example of how this should be conducted, and one can only hope that they can come together and rescue that agreement. And thirdly, the need to protect women, because rape is being used as a tool in these conflicts. And as the former Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom said, William Hague, who's been very active on this front, putting this issue on some of the biggest global agendas in his time, is that we've managed to work through agreements on biological warfare and chemical warfare, nuclear agreements, and yet somehow we view sexual violence and conflict as normal. There's nothing normal about it, and we have got to address it in a way that is more responsive and more accountable. And then, of course, the role that women have to play in post-conflict reconstruction, understanding that they have to be factored into the kinds of processes that are put in place to sustain a peace. So our ultimate goal is as simple as it is profound: to empower half the world's population as an equal partner in growing economies, in human development, in preventing conflict and building peace. It's critical to our global security. And as the Nobel Peace Prize Committee said back when Lema and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf got the award, we cannot achieve democracy and lasting peace in the world unless women obtain the same opportunities as men to influence development at all levels of society. So I often think about our own country and what it's taken for us to make the progress we've made, and still know there's much to be done. And I think of one of the young women who went to the Equal Rights Convention in upstate New York that took place some 150, 60 years ago in our own country. And she was doing what so many do even today, looking for an opportunity to better her life. And she joined a network, she connected with others, and she started out on this path, worried that nobody else would be on the road with her. And she knew she had to do it because the meager wages that she earned, she couldn't keep. Women didn't have the right to vote in the United States. If they found themselves in a miserable marriage, there was no divorce. They couldn't access education in quality ways. And she knew that something had to change, so she went off. And it wasn't until she said that the sun came up that she saw so many others on this road with her. And they were coming in their stagecoaches, they were at all the crossroads, and she said it was men and women. And a third of the signers of the Equal Rights Declaration were men, led by Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist. And he said there was something about the work that I was doing in raising up the women that somehow didn't seem as selfish as the work I was doing to end slavery and the effect it had on my own people. So this is part of the journey, this journey that we're all on for equal rights. And part of this is why, given the evidence-based case today, given all that we know that needs to be done, why investing in women is truly a global policy imperative. I think there are few moments when we have the opportunity to really take all that is happening today and tap that potential for a transformative leap. I think it will enable us to actually seize the moment and go faster and go forward, so we're not waiting another century to make some of the kinds of progress we need to be making at home and around the world. But this is a time that has come, and I think today we recognize, as we never have before, the moral imperative that it represents and the policy imperative that it represents. So thank you all very much. Wherever.
Okay, well, thanks very much for a great set of remarks. I know there are plenty of questions in the audience, so I'll just try to kick it off with one or two. We mentioned in the introduction your work on the National Plan for Women in Peace, Conflict, Peace, and Security. And I am curious what kind of experience you had when you got into the American equivalent of the deep state, when you were off working on this plan with the Pentagon and the intelligence community and others. What kind of feedback did you get, and what kind of trajectory did you see those folks on?
So this was adopted in late 2011. So we haven't had a whole lot of experience with it, but I think different parts of government are acting on it and taking it more seriously than others. When we came together in the White House over almost a year of negotiating this National Action Plan with our counterparts from various agencies in the government, it was our friends from the Pentagon who said it has to be accompanied by an executive order because it needs to be a command in a way of the president to begin to bring about these changes. And the Defense Department is involved in trainings of peacekeepers about others. The gender-based component of that is very critical. The combatant commands have a lot of work in this space. In Afghanistan, for example, very much engaged with the role that Afghan women were playing and needed to play. And in fact, the female engagement teams were part of our military who could actually engage with the local population in ways that, because of the cultural considerations, their male counterparts couldn't. But that said, I don't think, and the annual reporting that's gone done, we haven't made that kind of moving this issue up to the top in ways that we need to. And I think that still remains to be done so that it can be more significantly integrated into relevant operations. And it's about operational effectiveness. It's not an option. It should be viewed as a necessity in terms of operational effectiveness, not because somebody says it's the thing to do. In terms of our diplomatic efforts, obviously our ambassadors, our embassies in particular, are engaged around the world. Many of the countries in which they're engaged have their plans. Many of the countries are in conflict in some way. So they have a very critical role to play in how they integrate this into their own work. And I think we've seen far greater evidence of their utilization of incorporating the plan the way the president intended in terms of our diplomatic missions. In terms of the development piece, for example, they have really made a concerted effort in the work of USAID in those so-called RFPs, the notices that are put out for funding, to really ensure that there's a focus on these issues, again, with respect to areas in conflict and security considerations. And I think because of the personnel and the follow-through, that's been significantly vigorous. So it's checkered in terms of the impact. I think we will go at this. Interestingly, we're also working with other governments with them in terms of their own implementation. But I'm hoping that that this will get a lot of wind at its back, continue to get a lot of wind at its back. What I'm doing at Georgetown essentially came out of this process because it was very clear that people who are skeptical or don't see why do we need to do this too sort of syndrome, without creating an evidence-based case, a database demonstrating how women are leading for peace and what difference it makes, it's very hard to engage in ways that ideally we would want to see. And so doing that through research and through global convenings and through other ways of bringing academics and practitioners together, we're really trying to move this engine down the tracks with a bit more speed than we have seen heretofore. So I think it's going to take continuing work.
How do you think, how would you characterize the state of the research in the fields that you've been working on as a practitioner? Do you think that we are where we need to be, or that there's just a lot more to be done?
You know, when you look
and what should be done at Dartmouth in particular? If
well,
I can ask
hope Dartmouth will join the family on this in a significant way. When you look at the economic piece, there are clearly a lot of actors in the research. The private sector is very active because it has to do with the bottom line. And it has to do with emerging markets, and of course all of that feeds into the bottom line. The major multilateral institutions are critically engaged from the World Bank to the UN to the World Economic Forum, as I said, et cetera. There's just a plethora of data today that keeps coming out in significant ways. In this arena, we are in a much different place. We are at a much earlier place. And I think one of the things that would make a difference, and it's one of the reasons we've instituted workshops on bridging theory and practice. The academic community is engaged, obviously, in a lot of the research and academic work that is critically necessary. But the practitioners often have no idea what the academic community is doing, how it serves their interests. We reinvent the wheel all the time. It's what we know. It's what's in our toolbox. We don't go outside our toolbox for the most part. But the more we could be informed as practitioners in what makes sense, the better we would be. But by the same token, if the academic community would understand what practitioners need and what kind of avenues could be pursued, it would make a whole lot of difference. Our most recent one was on countering violent extremism, where we know that women are both being radicalized. We don't know all the reasons they're being radicalized, but we also know they're critical to countering violent extremism. And bringing together people from the State Department and other parts of our counterterrorism and countering violent extremism operations with academics who are very active in this space and becoming increasingly expert in this space, I think will produce the kind of answers or responses that would enable us in government, for example, to do a far better job in what's being funded, how we're pursuing it, et cetera. And it's been interesting to see the State Department, for example, recognizing this critical need today. And one of the things they have done is create an entity, help create an entity within the United States International Peace Agency, USIP, particularly to look at the research landscape, to bring experts together in this space to begin to think through what kind of research can be stimulated that would enable us to have better answers for where we need to be putting both our resources and our actions. So I think there's a lot that academia can do, maintaining its strong academic independence, but working in ways that a lot of that knowledge base can be better applied to where it's needed.
Why don't we open it up to the audience? I have a feeling there's some questions. Yes? Wait for the mic, sorry.
Hi, thank you for coming to visit. So much of the things that you've been talking about to improve the condition of women around the world seem to be carrots. And I'm wondering if you think that there should also be sticks that the United States can or should apply to countries that are egregiously mistreating women or spreading ideology or efforts that undermine the position of women around the world.
Well, I think it depends where you put your focus. It's not that the sticks don't exist, but I have been trying to make the case for why this is a critical investment. And one of the ways to do that today, particularly to persuade people who aren't active in this space, but who could play a critical role in the work they are doing that would make them that much more effective, is to factor in these issues. But you know, we sanction for human rights violations. We put a hold on aid programs. There are numbers of things that we do to send a signal, or as you said, to apply a stick as opposed to a carrot. But I would rather see us spend more time on making the case for why this is the smart and right thing to do, and creating positive outcomes out of that, than dwelling on you know, potential punitive measures. They are needed, clearly, at times. You know, one of the key things that comes to my mind is this annual report that the State Department puts out on human trafficking, where there's a mandate from the Congress as part of the law to look at countries in terms of what they're doing to address preventing human trafficking, what they're doing to prosecute the perpetrators of it, and what they're doing to protect the victims. And in the punitive category, that sort of naming and shaming and putting some of them at the bottom of the heap, sometimes it's what you have to do because they're repeat offenders, if you will. But at other times, it's not necessarily the quickest way to move in a positive direction. So I think you have to balance all of these things. It's not to say that there aren't times when we've got to do that, but I don't think we're doing enough in terms of incentivizing and making the case than we should be doing. Because as human beings, we are much more responsive to the positive, to what's in our self-interest, than we are to the punishments that are being meted out. Again, I'm not excluding the need for punitive actions at times, but I really think we need to do more in that positive space.
Right over here.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the challenges that the next administration is going to face when domestically we see that people may be on board with a candidate who is very anti-women's rights, and there's a large portion of our population that supports that and takes that viewpoint very strongly. And I feel that coming into the next administration, there's going to be a bit of a disconnect between people who are avid supporters of women's rights and people who are struggling to still grasp the issue.
Well, of course, we don't know what the outcome is going to be, and I'm not sure that there isn't, as horrific as the discussion has been and what we have had to see and hear over the last couple weeks has been, if there isn't a silver lining out of this. And by that, I think that what can come out of it and the abhorrence of what happened is that more and more people are recoiling from the view that you can condone assault on women, that you can brag about making women objects, and that you can indulge in the kind of conduct that was being demonstrated. And I think what we will see, and this is my hope, obviously, it's my hope ahead of the knowing what the reality will be, that it's already creating that kind of making the case, if you will, in a much bigger level of why this situation has to change. It is a big problem the world over. But I think more and more people today understand there's no place for this. And I'm hoping that it will lead to more positive respects, as god-awful as it's been. You're killing me because I'm losing my voice from this active day.
You know,
I'm going to keep going.
Get back here. Just a few more minutes.
That's
Just hang
okay.
in there.
I'm not complaining.
So as a student at Dartmouth, I'm a graduating senior really interested in working to improve girls' education, and I'm just wondering what you would recommend as the best way to kind of have the biggest impact in trying to have a career like that, or where someone coming from Dartmouth could be most effective, if that's in government, in policy, in working for the UN or different NGOs, or just from your experience, what you'd recommend.
I don't think there's any one route, and I think that's one of the great possibilities that you all have who are leaving higher education today to go on and make your careers. It used to be that you needed to join an NGO to save the world, whether that part of saving the world was educating girls where they have been precluded from that, or whether it's been any number of other good things to do. I think today there are many projects within the private sector where they have coupled with governments, for example, to focus on this space. You know, after Boko Haram went and kidnapped those girls in Chibok, and you saw what happened, I convened the corporate community that was active in Nigeria to see what, if anything, more they could do, because engaging in investing in girls' education and providing safe schools was absolutely critical. And what we found when we brought representatives together from the corporate community, the multinationals mostly active in Nigeria, was they didn't know what each other was doing. And they were all engaged in some way. And at that time, one of the groups was Accenture, and they said, pro bono, we will do a landscaping of what's going on with the hope that by coming together, understanding what we're doing, we can be much more effective, some of it working more collaboratively, other parts of our work with girls' education being invested differently, or somehow bringing a smaller investment, making it into a bigger investment. I mean, that's private sector engagement. I think there are any number of NGOs that are in this space today. Certainly the biggest work that's being done is at a governmental level, because whether it's our aid agencies or DFID or so many others, the commitment of Denmark, for example, in girls' education being very significant. In the scheme of things, a lot more needs to be done. But there are many actors, and I think you need to think through, where do I think I can best work? In what kind of setting? But it won't be that there'll be the lack of opportunities. I think first to think about where you might find that environment most conducive to you, or even working on the local level for an agency or for an NGO where you're actually firsthand working in these communities, particularly in the developing world, to make the situation much better than it is today for some. So I think there are myriad opportunities. I'm not ducking the question, because I think what is really exciting to me is that the options are myriad compared to what I think they once were.
And the Dickey Center can help you.
And you might get a paid internship
catalogs of
to start.
internships and fellowships and things like that. Denise.
You know, as Dan mentioned, we had President Yayaga here for 4 months, which was fantastic. And one of her major issues when she was president, and now since too, is dealing with the response to and the recovery from the war there and the use of rape and violence against women as a strategy, as you mentioned. And she talked about, and others, of course, across the world, the need for the reconciliation and recovery effort in order to do many of the positive things you're talking about in these societies. And I just wanted to hear your view on what you think about those sort of truth and reconciliation processes and why those are important. Obviously we want to stop in the current violence in Syria, in so many places, but then there's a recovery period that is really crucial, and I'd just like to hear your thoughts.
Well, first of all, I'm very close to President Yayaga, and she told me no end about the fantastic experience she had here at Dartmouth. In fact, I think if she could have, she would have stayed for a lot longer, but she had to give up at a certain point.
Yes.
But she's an extraordinary example. This is a woman who started as a police officer. She was really, at the entry level of law enforcement and managed to make her way up to the top of that effort, and then recognized as both her skill set and her compelling personality for the good that she could do in Kosovo. And I think, in fact, she is the good news story in Kosovo. They've got so many problems from their government across the board. The economy's in terrible shape, et cetera. But this is a critical area, which is healing has to take place. And I was telling one of the classes earlier that when I was in Bosnia not too long ago, our ambassador had asked me to meet with one of the Bosnian women who had indicated to him she wanted to tell me something. And when I went up to her, she was looking down. She could hardly talk about what she wanted to talk about. She was clearly very upset. This is a war that ended about 20 years ago. And she told me that she had been raped in that conflict, but that her rapist was the policeman on the corner. And she had to pass him every day. He was a stellar member of the community, and she couldn't live with herself. There's never been any accountability for a lot of these crimes, save for the perpetrators at the highest level, when this was among the things that they were prosecuted for. And I was in Bosnia more recently, where there is an ongoing effort. For the first time, they've had a court decision, favorable court decision about a prosecution in a certain case that came out of the conflict. But the problem is doing something about that prosecution. It will never result in anything. It was sort of a Pyrrhic victory. Efforts will continue. But the way that the laws are construed is you can't take this breadwinner and put him in prison, and you can't really follow throughs in a way you need to. I think that this whole transitional justice piece is a very serious piece. It means, first of all, that women have to be enabled to be healed somehow, psychologically, physically, everything that goes with healing. But there needs to be some kind of reparations. And I remember being in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, where sexual violence is a huge, huge problem. And the women there were telling me they want to go from their pain to power. And I thought, given the circumstances that they find themselves in, how could they even contemplate power? What kind of power were they talking about? And that's where they saw the reparations discussion today, that for them, power was having control over a market today. So that if you went through a healing process and you began to have a normal life again, you began to be able to grow your vegetables and take them to market, your life began to have normalcy. You had power again to be real people in their societies, not shun people on the margins, damaged, never healed. And there's a big discussion going on today about what do we do about these reparations. Truth and reconciliation is one process, but if there is the telling of the of the horrors, unspeakable, and that is therapeutic for those who feel they haven't been listened to. But there's nothing that comes out of it beyond that. I think it's also a problem. So what to do in this space is very important, and it's why with Syria today, even though there's obviously no way, let alone to end the hostilities, than to begin to do something about the perpetrators, there's at least the case is being made through forensics, through witness accounts, through taking the testimony of women to begin to put the case together so that a time will come when these kinds of issues can be responded to. And with respect to Bosnia, it was the women who had the courage to go to the International Criminal Court and basically tell what happened. And out of that has come an understanding of these crimes on a scale that was perpetrated as being equivalent to genocide or crimes against humanity, a scale that has to be addressed. But we are not at a place where we are doing what we need to do, as William Hague said, not to just look at this as a collateral of war, as something that's normal. We've got to go well beyond that. And President Yayaga is exactly right.
You still have a question?
Hello, Ambassador. Thank you for your remarks. Incentives notwithstanding, is there a concerted effort to also educate boys and men who control the lives of these women?
It is a real part of what's in being considered today, particularly in the arena of violence against women, whether it's on a domestic level or it's on a level of what's perpetrated in conflict. And that is the understanding that nothing will change unless men and boys are engaged. And some of the really interesting work that's going on is with men and boys. There's a group called Promundo, which works a lot on these issues. And what they've begun to do is demonstrate how when you begin this work with men, it's no longer just seen as bringing change for women, which critically needs to be done, but where they become the beneficiaries of change themselves, not adhering to the stereotypical definition of male behavior, engaging in this kind of grotesqueness, but really being liberated from that stereotype and conducting their lives differently. And I remember on several visits to India, there was a group that AID was funding, and that was young men to try to deal with this problem in their villages where there were extreme examples of what was going on. And they did a skit in front of me. They played the roles of the men and the women in this skit. And you could see it was stopping the violence in the way that they were dramatically acting it out. And on subsequent visits, they wanted to keep telling me what was going on. I mean, they would show up in different places. And I said, why are you so excited about this? Why are you so eager to tell me what's happening? And they said, because we've changed. We know we've made a difference for the women, but we've changed in ways we could not have imagined. So I think this very embryonic work that's going on in some ways needs to be done, and hopefully will lead to something on a much bigger scale, because it's clearly where it is happening. It's happening in ways that both begin to end the violence that's perpetrated against women, but it's also having that change component on the male participant. I'm glad you raised that issue.
Well, speaking of male participants, we have one right here.
Hi, my name is Liam Jolly. I'm a 20 or a freshman at Dartmouth.
You're a what?
I'm a 20, so I'm like a freshman. It's just like
Think of like the year they will graduate.
Okay.
So I have a long time left at Dartmouth. I was really interested in what you were saying about like women investing their own money, having control of their own money internationally. And that made me think, I was wondering what you think of kind of the gender wage gap at home and kind of the different, like your idea of that and ways that you think that could change.
Well, I think, you know, for women everywhere, it matters to be paid for your effort that you put into something. And I think the issue at home, I believe that this is, depending how the election turns out again, could potentially be one of those priority issues, equal pay for equal work. There are a number of issues that have huge economic consequences in the United States where we have increased income inequality. We've got to really work at a lot of these issues. But issues like this one are both categorized as a women's issue, but have an enormous impact for families and across the board for our economic well-being. So I think it's something that that and issues like the minimum wage, which has so many women on the bottom, issues like paid parental leave have huge ramifications. We're the only industrialized country in the world that doesn't have paid parental leave. Childcare, we have massive numbers of women in our workforce today. The majority of women with a child under 1 are in the workforce, working outside the home. And yet the net around them, that support net, which is critical to the functioning of our economy, is not there in the ways that it should be. So it's a big issue. I'm glad you raised it, but it's one that we clearly do need to address here as well.
Okay, I think we have time for, you had a question, and one last question?
Just a quick question, a continuation of the question, oh, I'm sorry, quick question, a continuation of the question about the male role in all of this and the education of the males in these developing countries, especially in schools where young boys have to be conditioned and taught, and those are the men who will grow up with this in their souls. And I wondered if there was anything being done in regard to teaching these young boys in schools, if there were any programs that would institute these kinds of feelings and beliefs in boys.
Well, it's a very good question, and there are, you know, I think one of the problems we have, we used to work for President Clinton in the White House, and he used to say, somewhere in America, every problem is being solved, we just don't know about it. And I think that's true in development too. There are so many really good programs that are beginning to get at really serious issues, like ensuring that in boys' education, they're understanding what's proper behavior and what's not. But we don't know enough about them, or we don't take them to scale. And I happen to know a number of programs in India, for example, because they've had to deal with this issue on a massive scale, where there are modules in the schools that really have this intended, they want this intended effect, the one you described, but they have it in the programs precisely to do that. And I think, again, you talk about research. This is where we really need to know, how are these things working? Where are they working? And what can be replicated in a way that if we did put resources into it and scale it, we could have far greater impacts than, you know, scattershot here, scattershot there, scattershot there. And I think that's something we clearly have to do better.
Well, that's a great place to end. John Sloan Dickey said that, you know, none of the world's problems were so bad that better people couldn't fix them. And so that was a very Dickey-esque answer you gave. And so I'm delighted to end on that note. And I really want to thank Melanne Verveer for coming today.
Thank you. Thank you all.